The date was November 1992, and on the Big Island of Hawaii, the air was a deceptive mix of tropical paradise and primordial fury. For most people, Hawaii is the ultimate escape, a land of swaying palms and turquoise waves. But for those who know the landscape, the beauty is just a thin veil over a churning, violent power. This wasn't just a routine filming assignment for a high-budget Hollywood erotic thriller called Sliver. It was a flirtation with an active volcano named Kilauea, specifically the Pu'o vent. This is a place where the Earth's crust is merely a suggestion, a jagged wound in the planet that breathes fire and ancient stone. We will follow three men, Christopher Duddy, Mike Benson, and the pilot Craig Hosking, as they descend into a literal hell on Earth, surviving a catastrophic crash, only to realize they are trapped 50 yards from a boiling lake of lava with a massive storm closing in. Why did the director of Sliver scrap the original ending of the movie after this real-life tragedy? And how does a human being survive 28 hours breathing air that is literally dissolving their lungs from the inside out? Before the smoke and the screams, there was the shimmering perfection of a Hawaiian morning. The production of Sliver was in full swing, and the crew needed the money shot, the kind of visceral, bubbling lava footage that only a low-altitude flight could provide. Pilot Craig Hosking was at the controls, a man used to the precision required for film work, while director of photography Mike Benson and his assistant Chris Duddy prepared their gear. They were tasked with capturing the raw essence of the volcano, the bubbling orange pits and the thick white plumes of toxic steam escaping from the earth. From the cockpit, the view was a stunning contrast of extremes. To one side, the brilliant blue of the Pacific Ocean and the lush green of the rainforest stretched toward the horizon, while beneath them lay the black, unforgiving expanse of the lava fields. Duddy looked at the camera monitors, watching the primeval landscape dance across the screens, and he remembers a specific thought crossing his mind. I can't believe I'm getting paid for this. It felt like a dream, but the dream was about to be shattered by a mechanical reality. A massive storm was brewing off the coast, and the crew was racing to get the last of their footage before the weather turned the sky into a graveyard. As they made their second pass over the gaping mouth of Pu'o, the atmosphere changed. Duddy happened to glance at the monitors and saw a terrifying sight. A thin corkscrew trail of white smoke forming in the air behind the helicopter. The engine didn't just sputter, it died. In an instant, the rhythmic thrum of the rotors was replaced by a hollow, whistling silence that felt heavier than any noise. Visibility vanished as a wall of thick, white volcanic smoke engulfed the cabin, turning the world into a featureless void. Duddy jolted his eyes away from the screens and looked through the open doors, only to see a jagged black cliff rushing toward them at terminal velocity. There was no time to pray, only time to brace for the end. A metallic scream tore through the air as the main rotor blade sheared off against the volcanic rock, sending the aircraft into a sickening, weightless freefall. They weren't just falling, they were being pulled into the throat of the earth itself. Everything happened with a violent, blurred speed that defied the senses. The helicopter plummeted into the crater, but by some impossible stroke of luck, it landed upright on its skids on a narrow, unstable ledge. As the dust and debris settled, a new sound emerged. The sharp, high-pitched hiss of escaping gases, and the low, rhythmic thumping of the lava lake nearby. Hosking's face was a mask of red. A deep gash near his eye was pouring blood, but they were all miraculously still breathing. They scrambled out of the wreckage, desperate to put distance between themselves and the fuel-soaked remains of the chopper. It was only then, as they stood on the shifting, hot ground, that the true horror of their situation became clear. They hadn't just survived a crash, they had been swallowed. Their ordeal was so visceral that the director of the film eventually scrapped the original ending because the real-life horror was too big for Hollywood to replicate. It was a fatal error to underestimate the power of the mountain, and now they were facing the hard way out against all odds. In the next few hours, every choice they made would determine if they became a tragic footnote in history or a testament to the triumph of human resilience. This was not a movie set, and there were no stunt doubles coming to save them from this unforgiving place. They were surrounded by a silence of the tomb, broken only by the rhythmic, terrifying thumping of the Earth's heartbeat. How does a human mind stay focused when the ground beneath your feet is a furnace door and the sky is a wall of poison? This is the true story of the shimmering trap and the impossible escape from the internal cauldron. The production of the erotic thriller Sliver was supposed to be a high-stakes Hollywood assignment, a chance for cinematographer Mike Benson and assistant Chris Duddy to capture the raw, primordial beauty of the Hawaiian landscape from the safety of a Bell 206 Jet Ranger. They hadn't just crashed, they had been delivered into a literal hell on Earth. The heat didn't just radiate from the lava pool, it seeped through the very soles of their shoes, turning the ground into a literal furnace door that threatened to melt rubber and skin alike. Christopher Duddy looked down at his feet and saw something that defied logic. With every step he took, small puffs of white smoke shot out from his footprints, as if the earth itself were exhaling. The air was a weapon. It was thick with the overwhelming stench of sulfur, a smell like thousands of rotting eggs being crushed under a massive weight. This wasn't just an unpleasant odor. The gas was a caustic acid that immediately began to dissolve the moisture in their throats and lungs. They all began to cough uncontrollably, a deep, racking sound that echoed off the jagged black walls of the vent. Duddy's eyes felt like they had been rubbed with shards of broken glass as the acidic mist began to burn his corneas. He knew they had to move. To stay at the bottom, near that bubbling orange lake, was to accept a slow death by suffocation or incineration. Although Duddy was paralyzed by a lifelong fear of heights, the primal terror of the fire below acted like a shot of pure adrenaline to his heart. He took the lead, clawing at the vertical face of the 300-foot cliff that led toward the volcano's mouth. The climb was gnarly, with the dried lava rock crumbling in his hands like stale crackers or brittle glass. He didn't look back. He scrambled upward until he reached a narrow ledge 150 feet above the crash site. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, he realized the white wall of sulfur had completely swallowed the world below him. He could hear Mike Benson and Craig Hosking shouting from the depths, their voices muffled and distorted by the heavy air. He called out to them, but the wind and the hiss of the steam seemed to pull the words right out of his mouth. He was alone in the mist. The realization hit him that in this cauldron, the ground isn't a foundation. It's a door to a place no human was ever meant to see. Every breath was now a conscious choice, between a lungful of oxygen or a lungful of poison. Would you have been able to keep your grip when the very rock you were holding onto was turning to dust? For Duddy, the answer was simple: climb or be consumed. As the three men scrambled out of the mangled fuselage, the first thing that hit them wasn't the sound of the volcano, but a wall of heat so thick it felt like walking into a solid object. They were standing on a narrow, precarious ledge, barely 50 yards away from a churning lake of molten rock that pulsed with a rhythmic, low-frequency throb. Every time Duddy took a step, a tiny puff of gray smoke hissed out from beneath his heel, marking his progress across the black crust. His shoes were melting. Along with the heat came the smell, a thick, cloying stench of hydrogen sulfide that saturated the air like 1,000 crates of rotting eggs broken open at once. It wasn't just an odor. It was a physical assault on their central nervous systems. Their lungs spasmed in a desperate attempt to reject the acidic vapor, leading to violent, uncontrollable coughing fits that threatened to black them out. Their eyes burned like fire. It felt as if someone was grinding shards of broken glass into their corneas with every blink, turning the world into a blurred, stinging nightmare. Christopher Duddy, driven by a paralyzing fear of heights and a sudden, sharper fear of being cremated alive, began to claw at the vertical wall of the vent. He was learning the hard way that the throat of a volcano is not a stable environment for a climb, snapping off in his hands like stale crackers and crumbling into fine black dust. The terrain was disintegrating. Huge chunks of the cliff face would shear away under his weight, tumbling back down into the whiteout below and vanishing without a sound. Adrenaline pushed Duddy 150 feet up the inner wall until his muscles screamed for a reprieve. He found a small, jagged outcropping and pressed his body against the stone, desperate for a pocket of air that didn't taste like poison. He called out for Mike Benson and Craig Hosking, but his voice was flat and hollow, muffled by the heavy atmosphere. There was no answer. A wall of white sulfur smoke had drifted between them, leaving Duddy suspended in a lightless void, utterly alone in the gut of the earth. He realized then that in this unforgiving place, every breath was a gamble. The silence of the tomb settled over his ledge, broken only by the distant wet sloshing of the lava pool below. He looked at his hands, shredded and bleeding from the sharp volcanic glass, and wondered if the others were already dead. The smoke was a living thing, swirling around him, hiding the ledge where the helicopter sat like a crushed beer can. In the volcano, hope is the first thing to burn away, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the climb. Would you have stayed in the relative safety of the wreckage, or would you have vanished into the mist, chasing a rim you couldn't even see? For Duddy, the ledge was no longer a refuge. It was a countdown. Craig Hosking scrambled back down toward the mangled remains of the Bell 206, his lungs screaming against the thick, acidic air. The cockpit was a jagged mess of glass and twisted aluminum, the dashboard crushed so severely it looked like it had been through a trash compactor. He knew the internal power was dead, but he reached for the professional camera battery they had been using for the shoot, desperately stripping wires with trembling hands to bypass the ruined electrical system. He finally managed to spark the radio to life, sending a jagged mayday into the void of the Big Island's emergency frequencies. He didn't wait for an answer. He simply spoke into the dead air, praying that someone, somewhere, was listening to the ghost in the volcano. The silence that followed was heavier than the sulfur. A low, rhythmic thumping began to vibrate through the rock, a sound that didn't belong to the primordial rumblings of the earth. Through a brief tear in the white sulfur curtain, a rescue helicopter appeared like a dragonfly hovering over the abyss, its rotors fighting the erratic thermal currents rising from the lava lake. Hosking stood on a small mound of volcanic debris, waving his arms and screaming until his throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. But the wind shifted, and a massive wall of white smoke surged upward, swallowing the rescue craft and the ledge in a blinding, opaque shroud. When the mist finally thinned minutes later, the helicopter was gone, and so was Craig Hosking. Duddy and Benson, perched higher up the cliff, stared down into the empty haze with a sickening realization. They were certain their pilot had been claimed by the fumes, or had fallen into the heat below. The world thinks a rescue team means you're safe. But inside a volcano, a rescue team is just a group of people watching you die. Hours later, voices drifted down from the rim, followed by the heavy, rhythmic whoosh of a rescue rope cutting through the sulphurous air. It was a thick, braided lifeline, a nylon umbilical cord snaking down toward the ledge where the men clung to the crumbling rock. Duddy reached out, his fingers straining against the air, watching the weighted end of the rope swing through the haze like a pendulum. It was close enough to see the individual fibers, yet it remained perpetually 10 feet out of reach, dancing just beyond his fingertips. He lunged for it once, his boots sliding on the loose ash, nearly sending him over the precipice. He missed. The rope was pulled back up into the whiteout, leaving him grasping at nothing but poison. The rangers above couldn't see the ledge, and they were terrified that moving closer to the unstable rim would trigger a landslide that would bury everyone in a tomb of hot gravel. As the sun began to dip, the voices from above grew faint, replaced by the rising whistle of a storm that promised to turn the crater into a freezing, lightless cauldron. At 5:30 p.m., the last thread of hope snapped when a muffled voice from the rim delivered a sentence that felt like a final death warrant. The rescuers were pulling back, retreating from the gale-force winds and the blinding rain to wait for the return of first light. Christopher Duddy sat on his narrow ledge, listening to the crunch of boots on gravel fading into the roar of the gathering storm. The realization hit him with the weight of the mountain itself. They were going to be in here all night. A Hawaiian storm is not just rain. It is a violent vertical deluge that turns the air into a cold and suffocating weight. Duddy was quickly soaked to the bone, his clothes clinging to his shivering frame while the rock beneath him remained a radiating furnace. It was a cruel biological paradox, where his chest was freezing in the mountain air, while his back was being slow cooked by the heat of the magma chamber below. He began to cough again, the rain mixing with the sulfur to create a mild acid that burned his throat with every desperate gasp. He knew that if he panicked now, he would slip from the ledge and vanish into the orange glow of the pit. He pulled his knees to his chest, curling into the smallest possible target for the elements. He pulled his sweatshirt up over his face and adjusted his baseball cap, creating a tiny, claustrophobic tent of his own recycled breath. Inside this meager fabric sanctuary, the air was slightly filtered, a fragile shield against the rotting egg stench that threatened to blister his lungs. Thirst began to claw at his throat, a sharp and metallic ache that made every attempt to swallow feel like rubbing sandpaper together. He reached out and placed his sunglasses on a small ridge of lava rock, positioning them to catch the runoff from the heavy rain. Every few minutes, he would carefully bring the glasses to his lips, sipping the few drops of lukewarm, ash-flecked water that had pooled in the lenses. It was not enough to hydrate his body, but it was just enough to keep his tongue from sticking to the roof of his mouth. As the darkness turned absolute, the volcano began its own terrifying and hypnotic performance. The thick plumes of sulphurous steam were no longer white. They were lit from beneath by the boiling lake of fire, turning the mist into a swirling kaleidoscope of neon orange, blood red, and sulfur yellow. It was the most beautiful thing Duddy had ever seen, and yet it was the very thing that was trying to kill him. This was the money shot they had come to film, but there were no cameras running now, only a man clinging to a cliff in a light show from hell. The earth beneath him was not a solid foundation. It was alive and breathing with a deep, rhythmic pulse. Every few minutes, a low-frequency tremble would vibrate through the rock, a subterranean heartbeat that rattled his teeth and shook his very bones. He could hear the lava flow, a constant and heavy rushing sound that mimicked a peaceful river moving through the woods, but this river was made of molten stone, and the sound was not water over pebbles, but the indifferent roar of the earth's blood moving through the veins of the mountain. Imagine sitting in that darkness, knowing that a single involuntary twitch in your sleep would send you tumbling 150 feet into a cauldron of liquid fire. Would you have the mental strength to stay awake, or would the exhaustion eventually win? Duddy stared into the shifting colors of the mist, feeling a sense of cosmic vertigo, a realization of how insignificant a human life is compared to the primordial fury of the planet. He was a small, wet insect, perched on the lip of a planetary wound, waiting for a morning that felt like it would never come. Only hours ago, he had been looking through a lens, dreaming of the perfect cinematic ending for a high-budget thriller. Now he was living a horror story that no Hollywood writer would dare to script because the reality was too relentless for an audience to believe. The rain continued to lash against his sweatshirt tent, and the smell of wet sulfur filled his senses, a reminder that he was breathing the atmosphere of a world that had not yet cooled. He closed his eyes and prayed that the ledge would hold for just 12 more hours, unaware that the rising sun would bring an even more desperate choice. By Sunday afternoon, the rescue helicopters had made several more attempts to punch through the whiteout, but each time the thick, churning clouds of steam and sulfur forced them to bank away, leaving the men below in a state of growing, suffocating despair. Christopher Duddy sat on his ledge, his throat so swollen from the acidic air that he could no longer swallow his own saliva. He watched the rim of the volcano, waiting for a rope that never stayed long enough to be grabbed. The rescuers vanished again. It was 4 o'clock when the heavy gray ceiling finally cracked, allowing a single, brilliant beam of sunlight to pierce the gloom and illuminate the cliff face directly above him. For 28 hours, the wall had looked like a vertical, featureless sheet of obsidian, but in this new light, Duddy saw a series of jagged outcroppings and narrow fissures that formed a desperate zigzagging path toward the top. He knew that his lungs were failing and that another night in a cauldron would likely be his last. He stood up on shaken legs, pressing his chest against the warm, vibrating rock. He began to climb. Adrenaline is a loan from the body that you eventually have to pay back with interest, but in that moment, Duddy was signing for whatever credit his nervous system could provide. The rock was brittle and treacherous, often snapping off in his hands like stale crackers and tumbling into the orange glow of the lava lake hundreds of feet below his boots. He reached the final 5 feet of the ascent, where the solid rock gave way to a steep slope of loose, razor-sharp volcanic gravel. Every time he tried to pull himself up, the ground shifted, sliding him backward toward the abyss. He had to lunge. He thrust his bare arms deep into the shifting scree, the sharp glass-like shards shredding his skin, as he used his own buried limbs as anchors to flip his body over the lip of the crater. He landed on his back on the rim, gasping in air that was finally free of the rotting egg stench of sulfur, staring up at a sky that he had never expected to see again. Behind him, Mike Benson remained on his own ledge, still trapped in the whiteout, unaware that his partner had just performed a feat of impossible physics to reach the surface. He was out of the hole, but he was now standing on a landscape that looked less like Earth and more like a cooling, jagged nightmare. By Sunday midday, the psychological weight of the volcano had become heavier than the physical heat, as the rescue teams appeared and vanished like ghosts in the mist. Duddy watched the ropes pull away for the final time, his throat so swollen from the sulfur-soaked air that he could no longer swallow his own spit. Every breath felt like inhaling a handful of needles, and he realized that if he stayed on this ledge, he would simply stop breathing before the sun rose again. He was done waiting. Then, at exactly 4 o'clock, a stray beam of sunlight pierced the thick white clouds and illuminated a section of the cliff he hadn't been able to see for 28 hours. The light didn't just show him a way out, it showed him the visceral reality of his own mortality. For over a day, the interior of the vent had been a white room of blinding smoke and a rotting egg stench, but this single beam of light acted as a navigation miracle. He looked at his hands, already raw and shaking, and knew he was driving on the rims of his physical capacity. There was no more time for staying put or trusting in the bureaucratic incompetence of a rescue effort that couldn't find a man 10 feet away. He stood up on that narrow ledge, his shoes melting against the stone, and made the choice to either fly or fall. It was a jagged spine of rock that seemed to lead toward the rim, a path that looked less like a trail and more like a desperate invitation. He knew that one slip would result in a 300-foot fall back into the throat of the beast, but the fear of the drop was finally eclipsed by the fear of the fumes. He began to move, his fingers clawing into the brittle, dried lava that crumbled like stale crackers under his weight. Adrenaline took the wheel. Adrenaline is a loan from the body that you eventually have to pay back with interest, and Duddy was spending every cent he had left. The final 5 feet were a test of sheer will against a crumbling world. The rock here wasn't solid. It was a loose, treacherous scree of volcanic glass that shifted with every heartbeat. Every time he reached up, the earth gave way, sending a cascade of sharp pebbles down into the sulphurous void below. He was forced to use his forearms as anchors, burying them into the jagged gravel until the skin was shredded and the blood began to slick the stones. It was a trade of his own flesh for his life. With a primal scream of effort, he levered his weight upward, flipping his body over the edge and landing hard on the flat, desolate rim. He lay there on his back, staring at a sky that finally tasted like oxygen instead of rot, listening to the distant rumble of the lava he had just escaped. The ground beneath him was no longer a vertical prison, but a vast moon-like expanse of black stone stretching toward the horizon. He had cheated the cauldron, but the silence of the rim was its own kind of haunting. He was alive. Now he just had to find his way back to the world of the living. The surface of the volcano was a jagged, black sea of cooled rock that felt more like another planet than the Hawaii he knew from the postcards. Duddy began to run. Through the haze of his stinging eyes, he saw a spark of artificial color that didn't belong in this primordial landscape. It was a neon orange traffic cone, a small plastic beacon of human intervention sitting atop the black rock. He followed the trail of cones like a breadcrumb path, his heart hammering against his ribs as they led him toward a cluster of small tents. This was the forward observation camp. But as he stumbled into the clearing, he realized it was deserted. The rescuers had likely pulled back due to the worsening storm, leaving behind only the ghosts of their presence. He found a stash of water bottles and tried to guzzle them, but his throat was so constricted from the sulfuric acid that the liquid felt like it was trying to pass through a needle. He couldn't swallow. He pushed past the tents and found a heavy oxygen tank, fumbling with the valves until the cool, metallic hiss of pure air filled his lungs. It was the first breath in over a day that didn't burn. As he sat there, clutching the mask to his face, the thrumming of a helicopter blade began to vibrate through the ground. He stood up, waving his arms with a frantic, jerky motion that used the very last of his reserves. The pilot spotted the lone figure standing amongst the tents and banked the aircraft toward the camp. As the skids touched down and a rescuer reached out to grab his arm, something inside Duddy finally snapped. They had to physically hoist him into the cabin, strapping his unresponsive body into the seat as the helicopter lifted off. But as the physical strength left him, a mental hysteria took its place. He began to bawl, the tears carving clean streaks through the soot and ash on his face. He grabbed at the rescuers, his voice a raw, sandpaper rasp, as he screamed that Mike was still down there. He pointed back toward the whiteout of the volcano, begging them to turn around, his mind unable to process his own safety while his friend remained on that ledge. Looking out the window, he saw the base camp coming into view, a chaotic hive of flashing lights and primary colors. There were ambulances, red fire trucks, and the white vans of news crews, all gathered like scavengers at the edge of the disaster. As the helicopter touched down, the doors slid open to a wall of humid tropical air and the frantic shouting of medics. Craig Hosking was there, his face bandaged but his eyes wide with disbelief as he helped pull Duddy from the aircraft. Duddy's eyes remained fixed on the mountain. The volcano was a silent white wall behind them, hiding the terrifying reality that Mike Benson was currently preparing to spend a second night alone in the heart of the furnace. How could a man already broken by the fumes and the cold possibly survive another 12 hours in the dark.